The cameras were flashing so fast it looked like a lightning storm outside the Manhattan Supreme Court. Alexander Vance, a man worth $14 billion, stepped out of his black armored SUV. He wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm, wearing a diamond choker that cost more than most people's houses, was Jessica Marone, his 24-year-old mistress. Alexander looked at the cameras and smiled that famous, arrogant predator's smile. He thought he had already won. He thought his wife, Catherine, was just a quiet relic of his past who would sign the papers and disappear. But inside the courtroom, sitting on the mahogany bench, Judge Anthony Ferraro was holding a sealed manila envelope that Alexander didn't know existed. One piece of paper inside that envelope was about to turn a $14 billion empire into dust. This is the story of the most brutal divorce trial in New York history. The humid July air in New York City felt heavy, pressing down on the hundreds of spectators gathered on the steps of the courthouse on Center Street. They weren't there for a murder trial or a mob boss sentencing. They were there for the dissolution of the Vance dynasty. Alexander Vance was the face of Auratech, a biomedical conglomerate that had revolutionized everything from pacemakers to synthetic skin. He was 48 years old, stood 6'2", and possessed the kind of jawline that graced the cover of Forbes and GQ in the same month. He was a titan, a god among men. And today he was playing the part perfectly. When the black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the curb, the crowd surged forward. Security guards in dark sunglasses had to physically shove paparazzi back to clear a path. Alexander stepped out first. He adjusted his bespoke navy Brioni suit, buttoned the jacket with a casual flick of his wrist, and then turned back to the car. He extended a hand. Out stepped Jessica Marone. The gasp from the crowd was audible. It wasn't just that she was there, everyone knew about the affair. It was the audacity of her appearance. Jessica was wearing white, a pristine white Chanel dress that looked suspiciously like something a bride would wear to a rehearsal dinner. She was 24, a former fitness influencer, with striking green eyes and hair the color of spun gold. She took Alexander's hand, interlaced her fingers with his, and rested her other hand protectively over her stomach. The message was clear. It was a declaration of war. I am the future. She is the past. Mr. Vance, is it true you're offering Mrs. Vance a settlement of $0? A reporter from the New York Post shouted. Alexander stopped it. He looked directly into the camera lens, his blue eyes icy. I don't pay for betrayal, he said smoothly, his voice carrying over the noise. The truth will come out today. Biology doesn't lie. He squeezed Jessica's hand, and she looked up at him with adoring, victorious eyes. They walked up the stairs like royalty, ascending a throne, ignoring the scattered boos from a group of women holding signs that read, Team Catherine. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was cold, sterile, and smelled of lemon polish and old wood. Sitting at the defendant's table was Catherine Vance. If Jessica was the sun, bright, burning, and demanding attention, Catherine was the moon, cool, distant, and enduring. She was 46, though she looked a decade younger. She wore a simple, structured charcoal dress that buttoned to the neck. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe chignon. She wore no jewelry, no wedding ring, no diamonds. She sat perfectly still, her back not touching the chair, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Next to her sat Olivia Hart, a divorce attorney, known in legal circles as the Velvet Guillotine. Olivia was small, older, with grey hair and reading glasses on a chain, but she had destroyed egos bigger than Alexander's. When Alexander and Jessica entered the courtroom, Alexander didn't even look at his wife of 20 years. He breezed past her table, the wake of his expensive cologne washing over her. Jessica, however, paused. She looked at Catherine, smirked, and deliberately smoothed her dress over her slight baby bump. Catherine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply watched them take their seats at the plaintiff's table, her expression unreadable. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Anthony Ferraro entered. He was a man known for his impatience with theatrics. He adjusted his robes, sat down, and peered over his spectacles at the circus before him. "This is the matter of Vance, Ver." "Vance." Judge Ferraro said, his voice gravelly. "I see we have a full house. I will warn you now, this is a court of law, not a reality TV show. One outburst and I clear the room." He looked at Alexander's lawyer, a shark named Marcus Stone, who charged $1.500 an hour. "Mr. Stone, you filed an emergency motion to expedite the divorce decree based on fraudulent inducement of marriage." "Yes, Your Honor." Marcus Stone stood up, buttoning his jacket. "My client, Mr. Vance, is filing for an annulment, not just a divorce. We intend to prove that the marriage was based on a lie from the very beginning, and therefore the prenuptial agreement is void, and Mrs. Vance is entitled to nothing." A murmur ran through the gallery. Catherine remained statue still. "And what is this lie?" the judge asked. Marcus Stone pointed a finger at Catherine. "That woman Catherine Vance claimed for 20 years to be a faithful wife. She claimed to be infertile, a tragedy that my client accepted out of love. But we have discovered that not only was she unfaithful, but her infertility was a charade to deny a great man his legacy. Meanwhile, Mrs. Marone here," he gestured to the mistress, "is carrying the proof of Mr. Vance's virility. We have DNA results pending for the child, but today we are presenting evidence of Mrs. Vance's biological deception." Alexander leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs. He looked at Catherine finally. It was a look of pure contempt. "I have you," his eyes said. "I have the money, the girl, the baby, and the lawyers. You have nothing." Catherine slowly turned her head. She met his gaze, and for the first time that morning, the corner of her lip twitched. It wasn't a smile. It was something scarier. It was pity. To understand the brutality of that moment in court, you have to understand who Catherine and Alexander were before the billions. 22 years ago, Alexander Vance wasn't a titan. He was a desperate PhD student at MIT, drowning in student loans and working out of a garage that smelled of mold and solder. He was brilliant manic and socially abrasive. He had the vision for Auratech, but he couldn't get a meeting with a bank manager, let alone a venture capitalist. He lacked the grace, the patience, and the emotional intelligence to sell his ideas. Enter Catherine Hale. Catherine was a scholarship student studying business administration. She wasn't born into money. She was the daughter of a coal miner from West Virginia. She had clawed her way into the Ivy League through sheer grit. She met Alexander at a library coffee shop where his card had been declined for a bagel. She bought him the bagel. They fell in love hard and fast. Or rather, Alexander fell in love with how Catherine made him feel powerful, organized, and capable. Catherine fell in love with his potential. She saw the genius beneath the arrogance. When they married 2 years later, Alexander was still broke. Catherine worked 2 jobs, one as a paralegal, one as a waitress to fund his research. She wrote the business plans. She charmed the investors he offended. She smoothed his rough edges. When Auratech finally launched its first product, a revolutionary glucose monitor, it was Catherine who negotiated the distribution deal that made them their first million. But as the millions turned into billions, the dynamic shifted. Alexander began to believe his own press. The magazines called him a self-made genius. He started to forget the nights Catherine stayed up until 4 a.m., editing his code or practicing his speeches with him. He started to see her not as his partner, but as his manager, and then eventually as his employee. The real fracture, however, was the children, or the lack of them. Alexander wanted a dynasty. He wanted a son to carry the Vance name. They tried for years. IVF specialists in Switzerland, hormone treatments that made Catherine sick for months. Nothing worked. The doctors gave vague reasons, unexplained infertility, but the burden always fell on Catherine. Alexander grew resentful. He stopped coming home for dinner. He started taking long business trips to Tokyo and Paris. He started sleeping in the guest room. Then came Jessica. Jessica Marone was an intern in the marketing department of Auratech. She was everything Catherine wasn't: loud, uncritical, and worshipful. She didn't challenge Alexander. She applauded him. She didn't ask about the ethics of his business deals. She asked how much the yacht cost. When Alexander turned 48, he hit a midlife crisis that hit like a freight train. He looked at Catherine with her sensible shoes and her wrinkles of worry, and he saw his mortality. He looked at Jessica and saw a second chance. 6 months before the court date, Alexander had come home to their penthouse on Park Avenue. Catherine was reading a book by the fire. "I want a divorce," he had said, tossing a manila envelope on the table. "Jessica is pregnant. She's giving me the son you never could." Catherine had closed her book slowly. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at the ultrasound picture he slid across the table. "Are you sure, Alexander?" she had asked softly. "Are you sure this is the path you want to take? Once you open this door, you can't close it." "I'm done with your dead weight, Catherine," he had sneered. "I'm taking the company. I'm taking the houses. My lawyers found a loophole in the prenup. If I can prove you deceived me about your health, about your ability to give me an heir, I can void the spousal support. You'll leave with what you came with. Nothing." Catherine had stood up then. She walked to the window, looking out at the city she had helped him conquer. "Very well," she whispered. "I'll see you in court." Now, sitting in that courtroom, Alexander thought that conversation was his victory speech. He didn't realize it was actually his Miranda warning. The courtroom was stifling. Marcus Stone, Alexander's lawyer, was pacing back and forth, weaving a narrative of victimhood for the billionaire. "Your Honor." Stone boomed. "Alexander Vance is a man who has given everything to society. He has cured diseases. He has employed thousands. All he asked for in return was a family. Catherine Vance knowingly trapped him in a barren marriage. We have testimony from a former housekeeper who heard Mrs. Vance say years ago that she never wanted children and would do whatever it took to avoid them. It was a lie. A paid-for lie." Catherine's hand tightened slightly on her pen, but she remained silent. Furthermore, Stone continued, walking over to the witness stand, where Jessica Marone was now seated. "We have Ms. Marone, young, vibrant, and carrying the future of the Vance legacy." Jessica sat in the witness box, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. She had been coached well. "Ms. Marone," Stone asked gently, "tell the court about your relationship with Mr. Vance." "We fell in love," Jessica said, her voice breathy. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. But Alex was so lonely. He told me his wife was cold, that she treated him like a business asset. He wanted a family so badly. When I found out I was pregnant, it was a miracle." "And you are certain the child is Mr. Vance's?" 100%, Jessica said, looking indignantly at the judge. "I have never been with anyone else since we met. This is Alexander's son. We've already named him. Alexander Vance Jr." Alexander beamed from his table. He looked at the press gallery, making sure they got the shot of him smiling at his pregnant mistress. "Objection," Olivia Hart said. She didn't stand up. She didn't raise her voice. She just said the word like she was ordering a coffee. "Grounds?" Judge Ferraro asked. "Relevance," Olivia said, standing up slowly. She smoothed her skirt. "Whether or not, Ms. Marone is pregnant is irrelevant to the division of assets acquired during a 20-year marriage, unless—" Olivia paused, looking directly at Alexander. "Unless Mr. Vance is claiming that this pregnancy proves his virility, and therefore proves my client is the defective party." "That is exactly what we are claiming," Stone shouted. "The pregnancy is proof that Mr. Vance is capable of fathering children, and Mrs. Vance was the issue." "Excellent," Olivia said. A small, dangerous smile touched her lips. "Then I would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence." Olivia picked up a document from her table. It wasn't a thick file. It was a single sheet of paper, old and yellowed at the edges. "Mr. Vance," Olivia said, walking toward the billionaire. "Do you recognize the name Dr. Elias Thorne?" Alexander's brow furrowed. The name sounded familiar but distant, like a memory from a nightmare. "No," he lied. "Let me refresh your memory," Olivia said. "Doctor, Thorne was a specialist at the Boston Urological Institute. You visited him in 1999, 2 months before you married Catherine." The room went silent. The air conditioning hummed loudly. Alexander's face went a shade paler. "I visited many doctors," Alexander scoffed. "I had a kidney stone." "Is that so?" Olivia turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this document is a medical record dated October 14th, 1999. It details a surgical procedure performed on Mr. Alexander Vance." Olivia turned back to the gallery, her voice projecting to the back of the room. "It was a vasectomy." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Jessica Marone stopped crying. Her mouth fell open. She looked at Alexander, her eyes wide, with sudden, genuine panic. "What?" she whispered. Alexander shot up from his chair. "That's a lie, I never—" "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Judge Ferraro barked. "I had it reversed," Alexander shouted, his composure cracking. "I had it reversed 5 years later when we started trying for kids. Catherine knows that we went to the clinic together." Olivia Hart nodded calmly. "Yes, you did go to a clinic to have it reversed in 2004. However," she walked back to her table and picked up a second piece of paper. This one was sealed with red tape. "We subpoenaed the records from that reversal surgery, Alexander. Did you ever actually read the post-operative report? Or did you just assume, because you are a titan and a god, that your body would simply obey your commands?" Alexander was frozen. He hadn't read it. He was Alexander Vance. He paid people to read things. He just assumed it worked because he wanted it to work. "The reversal failed, Mr. Vance," Olivia said, her voice dropping to a hush that was louder than a scream. "Scar tissue blocked the vas deferens. The doctor noted it in his file. He sent a letter to your home address explaining that the procedure was unsuccessful and that you were still effectively sterile. But you never saw that letter, did you?" Alexander looked at Catherine. Catherine looked back. Her eyes were sad. "I intercepted the letter," Catherine said clearly from her seat. It was the first time she had spoken. The courtroom erupted. "Order, order." Judge Ferraro banged his gavel. "Why?" Alexander whispered, looking at his wife in horror. "Why would you hide that?" "Because you were depressed," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "The company was failing. You were suicidal. If you knew you couldn't have children, it would have broken you. I took the blame. I let you believe I was the infertile one. I took the shots. I took the drugs. I let you hate me for 10 years because I loved you enough to carry your burden." She stood up, tears finally spilling over. "I protected your ego, Alexander. I protected your manhood." She pointed a shaking finger at Jessica, whose face had gone completely white. "But if you are sterile, Alexander, and the reversal failed," Catherine's voice hardened into steel, "then who is the father of that baby?" Every head in the courtroom whipped toward Jessica Marone. Alexander slowly turned to look at his mistress, the woman who claimed to be carrying his legacy, the woman he was destroying his marriage for. Jessica was trembling. She clutched her stomach. "Alex, no. The doctors are wrong. It's yours, I swear." "Mr. Stone." Judge Ferraro said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I believe you mentioned a DNA test was pending." Marcus Stone was sweating. He looked at his client, then at the mistress. "Yes, Your Honor." "Well." The judge reached for the sealed envelope on his bench, the one he had been guarding since the trial began. "As it happens, the lab expedited the results this morning. They were delivered directly to my chambers to ensure no tampering." Judge Ferraro held up the envelope. "Shall we open it?" The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing down on the lungs of everyone present. Even the court reporter had stopped typing her hands, hovering over the keys. Judge Ferraro didn't rush. He used a silver letter opener to slit the top of the envelope. The sound of tearing paper was the only noise in the room. He pulled out a single sheet of tri-folded paper, adjusted his glasses, and read it in silence. Alexander Vance was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were white. He looked at the judge, desperate for a nod, a smile, anything. Jessica Marone was hyperventilating her hand, clutching her stomach, her eyes darting between Alexander and the exit sign. Judge Ferraro looked up. He didn't look at Alexander. He looked at Jessica. "Ms. Marone." The judge said, his voice flat, "You testified under oath not 5 minutes ago that you have been faithful to Mr. Vance, and that he is the only possible father of your unborn child." "Yes," Jessica squeaked. "Yes, Your Honor." "This document is from Helix Genetics, a lab certified by the state of New York," the judge continued. "It compares the DNA profile of the amniotic fluid sample taken from you last week against the buccal swab provided by Mr. Vance." The judge turned the paper around so the court could see the bold text at the bottom. "The probability of paternity is 0%. The gallery exploded. It wasn't just a murmur, it was a roar. Reporters were shouting into their phones. The bailiff stepped forward, hand on his holster. "No," Alexander screamed. It was a guttural, animalistic sound. He turned on Jessica. "You lied. You lying little." "Mr. Vance, sit down!" Judge Ferraro shouted, banging the gavel so hard the wood chipped. But Alexander wasn't listening. The reality was crashing down on him. The vasectomy, the failed reversal, the sterility. Catherine had told the truth. He had been shooting blanks for 20 years, and Jessica had played him. "Who is it?" Alexander hissed, grabbing Jessica's arm. The security guard surged forward to separate them. "Who is he? Who did you sleep with?" Jessica was sobbing now, mascara running down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to. It just happened. You were always working. You were always in Japan. He was there. He listened to me." "Who?" Alexander roared. Olivia Hart, Catherine's lawyer, stood up. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield she had already won. "Your Honor," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the noise. "If Mr. Vance is finished assaulting the witness, the defense would like to call a surprise witness to clarify the paternity issue. We have subpoenaed him, and he is waiting in the corridor." "Who?" the judge asked, clearly enjoying this more than he let on. Mr. Julian Cross. The colour drained from Alexander's face completely. He staggered back, hitting his chair and collapsing into it. Julian Cross. Julian was Alexander's CFO, his best friend since college, the man who was the best man at his wedding to Catherine, the man who had poured the drinks when Alexander complained about Catherine's frigidity. Julian, the godfather of Auratech. The doors opened. Julian Cross walked in. He didn't look ashamed. He looked annoyed that he had been caught adjusting his silk tie. He walked past Alexander without making eye contact and took the stand. "Mr. Cross," Olivia asked, "are you having a sexual relationship with Jessica Marone?" Julian looked at the ceiling, then at the judge. "I plead the fifth. This isn't a criminal trial yet, Mr. Cross," the judge said. "Answer the question." "Yes," Julian sighed. "For about a year." Alexander looked like he was having a stroke. "You," he whispered. "You told me to leave her. You told me Catherine was holding me back. You encouraged the divorce." Julian finally looked at Alexander. His expression was cold. "You were tanking the stock, Alex. You were erratic. You were obsessed with this legacy nonsense. I did what I had to do to protect the company. And, well, Jessica is very persuasive." The betrayal was total. Alexander had thrown away a loyal wife for a mistress who was sleeping with his best friend who was helping him destroy his marriage. But Catherine Vance wasn't done yet. She leaned over to her lawyer and whispered, "Drop the hammer." Most people thought the DNA reveal was the climax. They thought the story ended with Alexander's humiliation. But Catherine Vance wasn't interested in humiliation. She was interested in justice. And in the world of billionaires, justice is spelled with dollar signs. Alexander sat slumped in his chair, a broken man. But his lawyer, Marcus Stone, was still trying to salvage the finances. "Your Honor," Stone stammered, "while the paternity issue is regrettable, it does not change the financial facts. Mr. Vance built Auratech. The prenuptial agreement stands. Mrs. Vance is entitled to a payout, but the controlling shares of the company belong to Alexander." Olivia Hart walked to the center of the room. She was holding a blue folder this time. "Actually," Olivia said, "that brings us to the matter of the Vance Legacy Trust." Alexander's head snapped up. He knew that name. 3 months ago, Olivia addressed the court. Mr. Vance, in anticipation of this divorce, attempted to hide significant assets. He transferred 51% of his voting shares in Auratech, effectively the controlling interest of the company, into an irrevocable trust. "That is standard estate planning," Stone argued. "The trust," Olivia continued ignoring him, "was designed to protect the assets from his wife. The beneficiary of the trust was named as my firstborn child, and the trustee, the person with the power to vote those shares until the child turns 18, was named as the biological mother of said child." Olivia paused. She let the words sink in. Alexander's eyes went wide. He started to shake his head. No. "You see the problem, Mr. Vance?" Olivia asked gently. "You drafted this trust assuming the child was yours. You assumed you would control Jessica, and therefore control the shares. But the child is not yours." Olivia turned to the judge. "However, the trust language is specific. It does not say Alexander Vance's biological child. It says the child currently in utero carried by Ms. Jessica Marone. You defined the heir by the pregnancy, not the DNA, because you were so arrogant you didn't think a DNA test was necessary." Alexander had been so sure of his virility, so eager to spite Catherine, that he had rushed the paperwork. He had locked 51% of his company into a box and handed the key to the pregnant woman. So, Olivia concluded, The controlling shares of Auratech are now under the trusteeship of Ms. Jessica Marone, who, as we have just established, is in a relationship with your CFO, Julian Cross. The courtroom gasped. Alexander looked at Julian. Julian Cross smiled. It was a small, shark-like smile. He knew. He had probably helped Alexander draft the trust. It was a coup, a hostile takeover disguised as a divorce strategy. "You stole my company," Alexander whispered. "You stole my company. You gave it to her, Alex," Julian said from the witness stand. "You literally signed it over." Alexander lunged. He leaped over the defense table, tackling his lawyer, scrambling toward Julian. "I'll kill you! I'll kill you both!" Bailiffs swarmed him. The billionaire, the genius. The face of Forbes was pinned to the dirty carpet of the courtroom floor, screaming obscenities, while his ex-best friend smoothed his suit and his ex-mistress wept into her hands. "Get him out of here," Judge Ferraro yelled. We are in recess for 30 minutes." As they dragged Alexander out, he looked back. Not at Jessica. Not at Julian. He looked at Catherine. Catherine was still sitting perfectly still. She watched him being dragged away with the same expression one might use when watching a bag of trash being loaded into a truck. She didn't look happy. She looked resolved. When the bailiff finally called the court back to order, the atmosphere had shifted from a spectacle to an autopsy. The air conditioner hummed aggressively, but it did nothing to cool the sweating brows of the men at the defense table. Alexander Vance was back in his seat, but the titan of industry was gone. In his place sat a man who looked like he had aged 10 years in a 30-minute recess. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were bloodshot. He kept glancing at the back of the room, where Julian Cross, his traitorous CFO and former best friend, was leaning against the wall, furiously typing on a BlackBerry, trying to outrun the disaster he had helped create. Judge Ferraro looked down at the assembly with the weary expression of a man who thought he had seen everything, only to realize he was watching a Greek tragedy unfold in real time. "Let the record show the parties are present," the judge intoned. "Mr. Stone, before the recess, your client was physically restrained after discovering his estate planning had backfired. Are we ready to proceed with a modicum of dignity?" Marcus Stone, Alexander's lawyer, stood up. He looked tired. He adjusted his cufflinks, a reflex of a man trying to maintain control when the ship is sinking. "Yes, Your Honor. We apologize for the outburst." However, Stone's voice gained a little strength. While the paternity revelations are shocking, and the issue regarding the voting rights of the company shares is a matter for a separate civil suit between Mr. Vance and the trustee, we are here today to finalize the divorce. Stone walked to the center of the room, regaining his rhythm. He was betting on the one thing that never failed him, the ironclad contract. The facts remain, Your Honor. Alexander Vance is the founder and CEO of Auratech. He generated $14 billion in value. Mrs. Vance, while a dutiful spouse, was a passenger on this rocket ship. She did not code the software. She did not engineer the synthetic skin. She did not negotiate with the FDA. The prenuptial agreement serves to protect the genius from the passenger. We move to enforce the prenup strictly. Mrs. Vance gets the agreed-upon $2 million, and we dissolve the marriage. Alexander nodded from his table. Yes, the money. He still had the money. Even if Julian and Jessica controlled the board for now, he was the founder. He was the brand. He could buy his way out of this. A passenger. The voice came from the plaintiff's table. It wasn't Olivia Hart. It was Catherine. She stood up slowly. She didn't look at the judge. She looked directly at Alexander. "Is that what you told them, Alex? Catherine asked, her voice dangerously calm. That I was a passenger. Mrs. Vance, please address the bench. The judge warned, though he didn't bang the gavel. My apologies, Your Honor, Catherine said, turning to the judge. But to determine the equitable distribution of assets, we must establish the source of those assets. Mr. Stone claims I contributed nothing. I would like to correct the record. Briefly, the judge said, Mr. Vance likes to tell the story of the garage days. Catherine began walking toward the witness stand, where Alexander sat looking small. He tells Forbes magazine that he ate ramen noodles and coded for 40 hours straight. He forgets to mention who bought the ramen. He forgets to mention who paid the rent on that garage, so the landlord didn't evict him and his servers. Domestic support is noted. Stone interrupted dismissively. That is standard spousal duty. I'm not talking about laundry, Mr. Stone, Catherine snapped. She turned back to Alexander. Tell them about 2008, Alexander. Alexander stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. The market crash. Catherine said, her voice rising slightly. Liquidity froze. Oratech had a $3 million payroll due and zero cash in the bank. The venture capitalists pulled their term sheets. You were in the bathroom throwing up blood because you were so terrified of bankruptcy. Do you remember who fixed it? Alexander stayed silent. His jaw clenched. I fixed it, Catherine said to the room. I sold my mother's engagement ring. I liquidated my 401k from my paralegal job. And I walked into the Bank of New York and refused to leave the manager's office for 9 hours until he approved a bridge loan against our house. I forged your signature on the application because you were too busy crying in the shower. A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery. And 2012, Catherine continued relentless. The patent infringement suit from BioGlobal. They were going to bury us. You wanted to settle. You wanted to give them 40% of the company just to make it go away. I spent 3 weeks in the basement of the university library, going through microfiche until I found the prior art from a 1980s Russian medical journal that invalidated their claim. I wrote the legal brief that saved your empire, Alexander. Me, the passenger. That's enough. Alexander slammed his hand on the table. You helped fine. You are a good wife that doesn't entitle you to my company. No, Catherine said softly. Being a good wife doesn't entitle me to the company. You're right. She signaled to Olivia Hart. But owning the intellectual property does. Olivia Hart stood up and placed a thick, leather-bound binder on the judge's bench. It landed with a heavy thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Your Honor, Olivia said, Mr. Stone is operating under the assumption that Oratech Inc. owns the patents for its products. That is a common misconception. Marcus Stone frowned. Of course they own them. It's a tech company. Actually, Olivia opened a file. The core patents, specifically, U.S. Patent 8901 for the synthetic dermis matrix and U.S. Patent 9204 for the algorithmic glucose monitor, are not held by Oratech. They are licensed to Oratech. Licensed from whom? The judge asked, peering over his glasses. From a holding company called Vance and Hale, Holdings LLC, incorporated in Delaware in 1999, Olivia stated. Alexander's face went white. He knew that name. Of course he knew it. He had come up with it. And who owns Vance and Hale Holdings? The judge asked. Catherine took a step forward. I do. Objection. Stone shouted, though he sounded panicked. That is a marital asset. Even if it's in her name, it was formed during the relationship. It's subject to the prenup. Not exactly, Catherine said, a cold smile touching her lips. Alexander, do you remember 5 years ago, the class action lawsuit in California, The one where the patients claimed the skin grafts were causing allergic reactions. Alexander nodded, slowly paralyzed. You were terrified, Catherine recounted. You were convinced they were going to pierce the corporate veil and come after our personal assets. You sat at the kitchen table and said, Cat, we need to hide the IP. If Aura Tech gets sued, they can take the company, but we can't let them take the patents. The patents are the gold mine. She turned to the gallery, addressing the audience as much as the judge. So his high-priced lawyers, perhaps even Mr. Stone's firm, came up with a strategy. Move the patents into a separate, clean LLC, a safe harbor. And to make sure it looked like a legitimate arm's-length transaction, and not just asset hiding, Alexander insisted that he couldn't be the owner. It had to be someone else. Someone he trusted implicitly. Someone who would never betray him. She paused. The silence was absolute. He transferred his 50% membership interest in Vance & Hale Holdings to me. For the sum of $1. I have the transfer deed here, signed by Alexander Vance. Olivia Hart held up the document. It was blown up on a projector screen for the court to see. There was Alexander's signature, bold, arrogant, and fatal. He transferred it to you, the judge mused, looking at the document. And did he ever transfer it back? No, Your Honor, Catherine said. The lawsuit in California was dismissed a year later. I reminded Alexander 3 times to execute the paperwork to restore his ownership. First he said he was too busy with the IPO. Then he said it was safer with me for tax purposes. And finally he met Jessica, and he forgot all about the boring paperwork. Catherine turned to look at Julian Cross, who was now staring at her with open-mouthed horror. You see, Julian, Catherine said, addressing the traitor directly. You and Jessica have successfully staged a hostile takeover of Aura Tech. You have the office building, you have the factories, you have the debt, and you have the overhead costs of 4,000 employees. She gestured to herself. But Aura Tech operates on a 5-year renewable license to use the patents held by my company. And guess what? She looked at her wristwatch. That license expired at midnight last night. No, Alexander gasped. No. Without a license. Catherine continued, her voice hard as steel. Aura Tech cannot legally manufacture a single square inch of synthetic skin. You cannot sell a single pacemaker. If you ship one product today, I will sue you for patent infringement in federal court, and I will win. The reality crashed into the room. Aura Tech was a car with no engine. It was a bakery with no flour. It was a $14 billion company that was effectively worth 0. You have the shell, Catherine said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. I have the pearl. This is extortion, Marcus Stone yelled, throwing his papers down. You are holding a public company hostage. I am protecting my property, Catherine countered coolly. Just like Alexander tried to protect his assets with a prenup. Just like he tried to protect his legacy with a trust. He taught me well. I'm just playing by his rules. Alexander slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The genius. The visionary. He had spent 20 years building a kingdom, only to realize he had built it on land owned by the woman he had just tried to discard. So, Catherine said, turning back to the judge. The question isn't how much of Alexander's money I get. The question is whether I decide to let his company survive at all. She looked at Alexander's shaking shoulders. I am willing to negotiate a new license, she said. Alexander looked up, hope, desperate and pathetic in his eyes. But the terms, Catherine said, her eyes flashing, have changed. The trap wasn't just sprung, it was welded shut. Catherine Vance hadn't just won the divorce, She had effectively acquired her husband's life's work for $1. The silence that followed Catherine's declaration was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and electric. It was the sound of a guillotine blade hanging suspended at the very top of its arc, waiting for gravity to do its terrible work. Marcus Stone, Alexander's highly paid shark of a lawyer, was the first to break the paralysis. He scrambled for the documents Catherine's lawyer, Olivia Hart, had placed on the bench. His hands, usually steady and manicured, were shaking so violently that the papers rattled like dry leaves in a gale. He scanned the articles of incorporation for Vance and Hale Holdings. He looked at the patent assignment dates. He looked at the signatures. Stone's face, which had maintained a tan, confident glow for the entire trial, turned the color of old wet ash. He looked at Alexander Vance, then at the judge, and finally he simply took off his glasses and placed them on the table. It was a gesture of surrender. There was no legal argument for this. It was a checkmate so absolute it rendered the game board irrelevant. "Is this true?" Alexander whispered. His voice was unrecognizable, a dry rasp that sounded like it belonged to a man dying of thirst in a desert. "Catherine, tell me this is a bluff." Catherine didn't look at him. She was busy organizing her purse, snapping a lipstick case shut, with a sharp click that echoed through the room. "I don't bluff, Alexander," she said, her voice calm, melodious, and utterly terrifying. "You know that. I plan. I execute. I endure. You were the one who liked to gamble. You gambled our marriage. You gambled your dignity. And now you've gambled your company. But the patents—" Alexander stammered, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. "I built the tech. I wrote the code. It's mine. You wrote the code in my garage on my computer while eating food I paid for." Catherine corrected him, her eyes finally locking onto his. "And 5 years ago, when you were terrified of that malpractice lawsuit in California, you begged me to hide the assets. You said, 'Cat, we need to put the IP in a safe harbor, a separate entity, something untouchable.' So we did. Vance and Hale Holdings. You transferred your 50% ownership to me for $1, Alexander. Do you remember, you said it was a brilliant maneuver to fool the auditors?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It was brilliant, just not for you." At the back of the courtroom, Julian Cross, the traitorous CFO, felt the bile rise in his throat. He was a numbers man. He lived his life in spreadsheets and profit margins. And in that split second, he ran the mental calculation of Auratech without the IP license. Auratech had 4,000 employees. It had 3 massive manufacturing plants in Ohio and Shenzhen. It had a fleet of corporate jets. It had debt, massive leveraged debt, used to fuel expansion. Without the license to manufacture the synthetic skin or the glucose monitors, the revenue would drop to 0 overnight. But the debt payments, the payroll, the overhead, those remained. The company wasn't just worthless. It was a radioactive crater. Julian pushed past the bailiff, ignoring the judge's shout of protest. He practically ran to the plaintiff's table, grabbing the edge of the mahogany wood, his knuckles white. "Catherine!" Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. The suave, arrogant executive was gone. In his place was a desperate man watching his net worth incinerate. "Catherine, listen to me. We can fix this. You don't want to destroy the legacy. Think about the shareholders. Think about the employees. If you pull the license, 4,000 people lose their jobs tomorrow." Catherine turned to him slowly. She looked at Julian with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a bacteria sample. "Don't speak to me about the employees, Julian," she said softly. "I know their names. I set up their pension fund. You're the one who proposed cutting their healthcare benefits last quarter to boost the stock price by 3 cents. I read the board minutes. Julian flinched as if slapped. I am willing to offer a license to Auratech. Catherine continued, her voice projecting clearly to the court reporter and the mesmerized press gallery. I am not a monster. I won't let the company collapse immediately. Hope flared in Alexander's eyes. You will... Yes, Catherine said. I will grant Auratech a non-exclusive, revocable license to use the Vance and Hale patents. The cost of this license will be 100% of the net profits of Auratech, calculated quarterly. The room gasped. 100%, Julian choked out. That leaves nothing. That leaves 0 for reinvestment, 0 for dividends, 0 for us. Correction, Catherine said. It leaves enough to pay the employees and keep the lights on. It just leaves nothing for the shareholders, nothing for the executives, nothing for the trust. She shifted her gaze to Jessica Marone. Jessica was sitting in the witness box, her hands cradling her baby bump, her face a mask of confusion. She didn't understand LLCs or IP law. She only understood that the mood in the room had shifted from victory to funeral. Ms. Marone, Catherine said politely, congratulations. You are the trustee of the majority share of Auratech. You now control a company that exists solely to generate profit for me. You have all the liability, all the stress, all the public scrutiny. And I get the check. It seems you finally got the attention you were desperate for. Jessica looked at Alexander, panic rising in her chest. Alex, what does she mean, fix it? You said you were a billionaire. You said I wouldn't have to worry. Alexander didn't answer her. He couldn't. He was slumped in his chair, staring at his hands. The reality was settling in like concrete, hardening around his feet. He had lost everything. Not just the money. He had lost the narrative. He was no longer the genius inventor. He was the fool who handed his kingdom to his enemies and gave the keys to the castle to his ex-wife. Your Honor, Olivia Hart interrupted the tableau, her voice brisk and professional. We have one final matter, the annulment. Judge Ferraro cleared his throat. He had seen many divorces, but never an execution quite this efficient. Yes, Mr. Vance's motion for annulment based on fraud. Marcus Stone stood up shakily. Your Honor, in light of recent revelations, my client wishes to withdraw the motion for annulment. We would like to proceed with a standard divorce filing subject to equitable distribution of assets. It was a desperate claw-back attempt. If they divorced normally, Alexander could argue that the increase in value of Vance and Hale Holdings was marital property. He could fight for a slice of Catherine's pie. Objection, Olivia Hart barked. Mr. Vance stated under oath not 1 hour ago that this marriage was fraudulent from the inception. He claimed my client deceived him for 20 years. He cannot retract a sworn statement just because the financial wind has shifted. Catherine raised a hand, silencing her own lawyer. It's fine, Olivia, Catherine said. She looked at Alexander. He wants to withdraw. Let him. Alexander looked up, confusion warring with hope. You want to stay married? No, Catherine said. I'm saying it doesn't matter what you file, Alexander, because I am countersuing for annulment. She picked up the final piece of evidence from her table. You see, Alexander, an annulment requires proof that the marriage was based on a lie. You claimed the lie was my fertility, but the real lie was your fidelity. She walked closer to him, stopping just outside of grabbing range. I found the second phone, Alex, she whispered. Alexander froze. I found the burner phone you kept taped under the drawer in your office. I have the logs. You weren't just with Jessica. You were with her. She pointed to a young paralegal in the second row, whose face went crimson. And the PR consultant in London, and Julian's former assistant. The courtroom erupted into chaos again. Julian looked at Alexander with fresh horror. My assistant, Sarah Yu, slept with Sarah. The marriage was a sham, Catherine said, her voice rising over the noise. Not because I couldn't give you a child, but because you were incapable of being a husband. I want the annulment. I want my name back. I want Vance scraped off my identity like the mud it is. She turned to the judge. Grant the annulment, Your Honor. Wipe the slate clean. Let him keep his billions in Auratech stock. I want nothing from him. Absolutely nothing. It was the ultimate insult. She wasn't fighting for his money because she deemed it and him worthless. Judge Ferraro didn't hesitate. He banged the gavel. Motion for annulment granted, the judge bellowed. The marriage is declared void ab initio. You are legally strangers. The court awards no spousal support. Each party retains the assets currently in their name. Case closed. The sound of the gavel was like a gunshot. Alexander sat there legally single, legally the owner of Auratech, and utterly destitute. Catherine picked up her bag. She didn't look back at the man she had loved for 2 decades. She turned and began to walk down the center aisle. The reporters swarmed. Mrs. Vance, Mrs. Vance. What will you do now? Are you going to bankrupt the company? Mrs. Vance, how do you feel? Catherine stopped near the doors. She adjusted her sunglasses, shielding her eyes from the blinding flashbulbs. She looked into the lens of the nearest camera, knowing that this feed was being broadcast live to the world, to the board of directors, to the investors. It's Ms. Hale, she corrected the reporter. And as for how I feel... She paused, and for the first time in years, a genuine, unburdened smile graced her lips. It made her look 10 years younger. I feel like I finally dropped the dead weight. She pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the humid New York afternoon. Behind her, inside the courtroom, the screaming started. Julian was shoving Alexander. Jessica was sobbing, screaming that she had been tricked. Marcus Stone was trying to resign. Alexander Vance remained in his chair, staring at the empty doorway where his wife had stood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had one notification. It was a Bloomberg News alert. Breaking Auratech stock plummets, 92% following divorce ruling. Vance & Hale Holdings announces exclusive licensing deal with competitor Medtronic. He read it again. Exclusive deal with Medtronic. She had lied. She wasn't going to license it to him. She had already sold the rights to his biggest rival. She had given him hope of a lifeline, just to watch him struggle for air, only to cut the line the moment she walked out the door. A laugh bubbled up in Alexander's throat. It was a wet, hysterical sound. She played me, he whispered to the empty air. She played us all. He looked at Jessica, who was now being questioned by a federal marshal regarding the assets in the trust. He looked at Julian, who was being restrained by bailiffs. Alexander Vance, the boy who came from nothing, had returned to nothing. He closed his eyes, leaned his head back, and listened to the sound of his empire crumbling into dust, brick by billion-dollar brick. And that is how Catherine Hale turned a walk of shame into a victory lap. She proved that in the game of chess, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board, but only if she knows when to strike. Alexander Vance wanted a legacy, but he forgot that a legacy isn't built on money or bloodlines, it's built on loyalty, and when he broke that loyalty, he broke his own future. What do you guys think? Did Catherine go too far by destroying the company, or did Alexander deserve every single bit of it? And what about Julian, the best friend, who stabbed him in the back? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice betrayal and billion-dollar revenge, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. I've got another crazy case coming up next week about a lottery winner who hid his ticket in a place you will never guess. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.